kind of occurred very quietly. It wasn't there was no public involvement. This is before laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. So none of that legislation was on the books. And forestry schools were cranking out graduates, saying, educating them, saying, the best thing you can do as a professional forester is to cut this old growth and convert it to managed stands, where you can do thinning and fertilization and a number of intensive management practices like they do in Europe. So they didn't have the benefit of research at the time that said, wait a minute, these old growth forests are very complex ecosystems, and they harbor wildlife which is threatened and endangered, things like the spotted owl. So they didn't have the benefit of that information. So they were operating under a very pro-management paradigm. So I'll pick up the rest of the story in just a few minutes. We're going to stop for a restroom break shortly here. So I have about 9:40. Let's give ourselves about 10 minutes. No more than 10 minutes. Joe's going to park the bus right by the restrooms. I'll point those out. If you have time, go ahead and walk in the visitor center. There's a number of really nice displays and maps there. So the restrooms are on your left. At the beginning of the tour, it's very unusual to see an unfiltered water supply like we have for Bull Run. So just to give you an idea of who the other unfiltered systems are, in terms of large cities, New York City they have two major water sources, one of which is unfiltered. The Catskill, Delaware watershed is unfiltered. It's about 10 times the land area of Bull Run. We serve maybe 160 million gallons a day. Max, they serve 1 billion gallon per day water supply. We're crossing the Zigzag River back there. We'll be crossing the Sandy River just shortly, and then we'll be paralleling the Sandy River for about maybe a half a mile to a mile. And you'll be able to get an idea when I talk about that glacial flower characteristic of water that's drained from glaciers. You'll be able to see how milky white the Sandy is. So in addition to New York City, the other major unfiltered water supplies in the U.S. are Boston, Massachusetts, San Francisco, Seattle. Yeah, that's it. So there's only 5 total. So Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, and New York City are the last remaining large unfiltered water systems in the U.S. And since we had a number of positive detects on cryptosporidium between January and March this year, City Council is in a tough position. They have to come up with a plan to submit to the Oregon Health Authority, I think by early September, that says how are we going to treat Bull Run water to guard against cryptosporidium. And there's 2 choices. One is to upgrade our disinfection to ultraviolet light disinfection. The second option is to build a filtration plant. The cost for ultraviolet light disinfection is about, so here's the Sandy River. You can see how milky white the Sandy is. The cost for ultraviolet light disinfection is about $105 million, about I think $1.5 million per year for operation and maintenance costs on average. The cost for filtration ranges between $350 million to $500 million, and the O&M cost. Here's another good view of the Sandy off to our right. The O&M annual cost for filtration is around maybe $2.5 million a year. So currently, all of the intensive water sampling we do to comply with our variants for the LT2 rule costs us about $1 million per year. So we would be looking at O&M costs about 2.5 times what they are now if we had a filtration plant.
So could they just do bonds for that?
Question?
Bonds? Could they just do bonds for that instead of charging?
Yeah, they would sell bonds to finance that. Yeah. So there might be kind of a blended alternative. I think I went to a council work session June 27th where the Water Bureau administrator presented technical information to city council, and he said that one off. She said if I had a money printing press on the third floor of the Porta building instead of a billing machine, hands down he would build a filtration plant. The city can't print its own dollar bills, so that's not an option. So his recommendation, I think, is going to be let's build ultraviolet light disinfection now, and let's squirrel away some cash over the next 15, 20 years to eventually build a filtration plant. But it would be less expensive in the long term if we kind of prepared for that eventuality now and started saving money for it rather than deal with the rate shock of all of a sudden needing to sell bonds to finance a $500 million system, which in 15 to 20 years it's no longer going to be $500 million. It's going to be more like double that, right? So I'll kind of pick up where I left off on the Bull Run story. I mentioned that logging began on a programmatic basis in 1958. The Forest Service objective at that time was to log 1% of the watershed per year. So it's roughly 100 square miles. Their objective was to log about 1 square mile, which is about 640 acres each year, so that by the end of that 100-year period, they would convert all of the old growth forest to young growth stands. So they kind of quietly went about doing that, building roads, logging timber. There was not opposition from the public, I think in large part because they didn't really know about it. Also in 1959, the Forest Service Regional Forester at their downtown office. So Region 6 of the Forest Service is all the national forests in Oregon and Washington. And the supervisor in charge of all those forests in 1959, with a stroke of a pen, he administratively reduced the boundary of the Bull Run from the 1892 boundary of 222 square miles. He reduced it by 40,000 acres. He removed a large block of land which is on the west slope of Mount Hood. There was land over on the north side of the Bull Run that extended down to the Columbia River Gorge. So that land was opened up to recreation. Areas like Ramona Falls, if you hiked in Ramona Falls, if you camped at McNeil Campground, so those areas then became accessible in 1959. So the public began using those areas for hiking and for camping and for fishing and hunting. The city wasn't opposed to that because there was still a sufficient land area to protect the watershed, even removing 42,000 acres in 1959. Well, in 1971, something very interesting happened. There was a very small article in the Oregonian announcing to the public that the Forest Service is holding a public meeting in Corbett to present information about a proposal to open up about a third of the Bull Run Watershed to recreation, to day hiking, overnight camping, to boating in the reservoirs. So a gentleman named Dr. Joseph Smith, he was an internist physician. He moved to Portland in 1949. He was a native of Chicago, Illinois. He bought some property on the southwest corner of the Bull Run in the late 1940s with the intent of he and his wife retiring there sometime in the 1970s. He'd always heard legendary things about how protected the Bull Run was, so he thought, what better place to have property is right on the boundary of the Bull Run Watershed. Well, Dr. Miller saw that announcement for the public meeting. He attended the meeting, and he was pretty shocked to hear this notion of opening up a large chunk of the watershed to recreation. He started asking other questions. Well, like what else is going on inside the lock gates that I don't know about? And he came to find out that there had been pretty extensive logging in the prior 13 years. To get a better idea how much logging had occurred, he hired a private pilot to fly him over the watershed, and he was very surprised to see the amount of clear cutting that had occurred. He took matters into his own hands at that point, and he filed a federal lawsuit in district court in Portland in 1973. He sued the Forest Service, and he said the logging that had occurred, that was occurring now, and that was planned in the future, was in violation of that old 1904 law that I told you about, called the Bull Run Trespass Act. And remember the key words that I said? The only entry allowed by the Forest Service is to protect the forest. Well, the Forest Service and their federal attorneys, they scoffed at the lawsuit. They said, well, of course we're protecting the forest. We're mitigating the fire hazard. That old growth timber is a fire hazard, and we're doing the city a favor by logging it and converting it to these young plantations that are more fireproof. Well, the data didn't really show that, because oftentimes when the Forest Service logged, they burned the slash, and they had incidents of escaped slash burns that were on the scale of 1,000 acres. They had fires at 1,000 acres in size that were burning down some of the old growth adjacent to their clear cuts. And the district court judge sided in favor of Dr. Miller in 1976, and he said, you know, you're a physician, but you're a pretty smart guy, and the Forest Service had in fact violated the terms of that 1904 law. Well, the federal attorneys argued, well, that law is superseded by more national scale laws like the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960 and other more programmatic direction that the Forest Service operates under. Well, the judge said no, that 1904 law, that one paragraph, two sentence law, is the law of the land for the watershed. So at that point, three groups had a crisis on their hand. The Forest Service and the timber industry had a crisis because they had become dependent on the Bull Run for flow of timber to the local mills. Forest Service had foresters and road engineers who were staffed up to be able to do logging in the Bull Run. So I'm going to pause in my story. If you look off to the right side, you've got a pretty cool view of Mount Hood. And this flat valley here is called Old Maid Flat. And the geologic origin is a lahar flow off of the western flanks of Mount Hood. That happened in around 1793. And that is the namesake for the Sandy River, because when that massive lahar flow happened, a little more than a decade before the Lewis and Clark expedition made their way to Astoria, the silt from this lahar flow, what's that?
You've got a car very dangerously on your left.
Is just to the left of the bus?
Right there.
Oh, wow.
To pass you.
There we go.
Dangerous.
It's from Idaho.
In a hurry to get somewhere, I guess.
Anyway, so sediment from this lahar flow made its way all the way to the mouth of the Sandy, and when Lewis and Clark made their way across the mouth of the Sandy in 1805, they sank to their knees in the soft silt, and they named the river the Quicksand River, and that was ultimately shortened to the Sandy River. And so scientists can date the age of that lahar flow by looking at the tree ring pattern on trees that are buried in the sediment and comparing that to the ring growth of live trees that predate the geologic event. So that area off to the right side of the bus, this used to be part of the original Bull Run Reserve. So this area has been open to recreation since 1959. And so that recreation community was the second group that had a crisis on their hands, because they were accustomed to going for hikes in this area on the right side of the bus. Well, the judge's ruling said that the Forest Service needed to block off this road right at the National Forest boundary. As a result, the recreation community could no longer access some of their favorite campgrounds and hiking trails here. The third group that had a crisis was the city of Portland, because we had our eye on developing hydropower in the Bull Run, but that 1904 law was so narrow, and the judge's ruling was that the purpose of the Bull Run Watershed was for water supply and not for hydropower. So we could not legally construct powerhouses and operate them under the terms of that 1904 law. So the various factions went to work, and they submitted draft bills to Congress to rewrite, to basically amend that 1904 law and have a more modern law that reflected current conditions. The law that was ultimately passed by Congress in 1977 and signed by Jimmy Carter in November 1977 is called the Bull Run Management Act. And it said, first and foremost, the primary purpose of the Bull Run is a water supply for the city of Portland and its retail and wholesale customers. However, the Forest Service can practice multiple use management as long as water quality is protected. Dr. Miller said that there was a major flaw in that law because he said it was like having the fox guard the chicken coop. The Forest Service was in charge of developing these water quality standards, and they were in charge of deciding whether or not their management activities violated those standards. I was in dozens and dozens of meetings with Dr. Miller. He died in 2006 in his mid 90s, and he often said, well, the analogy is that you're hired to be a dishwasher, and the standard by which you're given to say what a clean spoon is a dirty spoon. Because the database to develop those water quality standards was data collected during a period of heavy logging activity. So he said it doesn't make any sense to have that become the standard or the benchmark by which to judge, whether the quality of the water is adequate. The Forest Service resumed logging in 1977, and the last clear-cut logging that was done in the Bull Run was 1993. Most of the logging over the final 10-year period from 83 to 93 was salvage of wind-thrown timber. There was a massive windstorm that happened on Christmas Day, 1983. I don't know how many of you were in Portland at that time, or maybe even alive at that time. But, I was in Portland. I had just moved, and my wife and I were in a church service on Christmas Day, and I'll never forget. The winds were so strong it shattered the glass doors on the church.
Wow.
Just from the wind pressure. Just the difference in wind pressure. Meanwhile, up in the watershed, we had 100-mile-an-hour winds. The anemometer spun off its pole because the winds were so strong. It flattened timber on about 3,500 acres. So these are trees that were just mowed down like grass. And at that point, the Forest Service said, "Well, we need to salvage log these areas because having all of this woody fuel on the ground presents a fuel hazard." So part of my job was to go out in the field with the Forest Service foresters and road engineers and make some yes/no decisions about which areas should be salvage logged, and if so, how they should go about logging it, whether with ground-based equipment or cable logging or helicopters. So not every day in the watershed is a nice sunny day like this where you can wear shorts and tennis shoes. I remember many miserable days in January and February climbing up and over 6-foot diameter logs and in rain gear and slipping and falling and getting tangled in blackberries. So it's not always as idyllic as looking out the bus window saying, "Hey, this is a great place to go for a hike." So the power line on the right side of the bus is the Bonneville power line. This connects to Bonneville Dam and the Columbia River, and then connects to the part of the major electric grid here in Oregon. Favorite hikes. So the question, what are some of my favorite hikes? There's a hike called the Bald Mountain Trail, which is on kind of the northwest side of Mount Hood. That's a really fun hike. Bald, B-A-L-D, Bald Mountain, And then kind of an interesting story. The Water Bureau was concerned about fire ignitions in the Mount Hood area from recreationists in the early 1900s. So they donated money to the Forest Service to build a log cabin in the Ramona Falls area. It's now in part of the Mount Hood Wilderness. So it was a cabin built, I think, in the 1920s, and they had a fire watchman who lived in that cabin during fire season. Unfortunately, the cabin hasn't been maintained over these decades, so it's kind of fallen into disrepair. The map that I showed you earlier that showed that heavy black line, so the area on the left side of the bus is part of that Bull Run closure area. And from time to time, you'll see some yellow signs that will be alerting members of the public that this is now closed to public entry.
No trespassing.
Yeah, did you see the yellow sign back there?
Yeah.
Right. So the fine is that they've never really thrown the full book at people legally. But legally, the federal judges have the authority to levy a fine of up to $5,000 and or 6 months in jail for bull run trespass. The biggest problem we have with trespass along this road is probably like target shooters who will bring their rifles out and some targets and be shooting away. That's it's not a water quality issue, but there have been situations where not in this area, but in other areas nearby, where target shooters have started fires because of bullets ricocheting off rocks and hitting vegetation. They've actually had fires start during the summer from target shooting. So. I don't know how many of you were here in Portland or in the Northwest in the early 1990s, but if you were, you might remember what they call the Timber Wars. That's when there were a lot of court battles about environmental groups were trying to block the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management from doing logging in old growth forests in the Northwest, in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, in order to protect the spotted owl. So it led to kind of a gridlock situation with regard to doing logging on national forest land and BLM land. President Clinton, when he was in office, he came to Portland in 1993 in an attempt to kind of try and break that political logjam. He commissioned a team of scientists to come up with a credible, scientifically based plan that could protect the northern spotted owl and other old growth dependent species, but also provide some kind of a steady flow of timber from national forest lands within the spotted owl range. They prepared that plan in 1994. It was called the Northwest Forest Plan. It set aside, one of the hallmarks of that plan was setting aside these very large areas on the scale of hundreds of thousands of acres called late successional reserves that would be off limits to most kinds of intensive forest management. One of those reserves was established in the Bull Run, and we thought that would satisfy most of the environmental groups. That would put most of the Bull Run off limits to commercial logging. The environmental groups were not fully satisfied with that administrative plan because it could be undone by the next administration with the stroke of a pen. So the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Interior could undo that plan in a heartbeat by just revising the plan and tossing it in the garbage. And that's where we are today. I mean, that plan is still vulnerable. It could be revised at any moment if President Trump wants to direct his Secretary of Agriculture and Interior to modify the plan. He has the authority to do that. How's the spotted owl doing now? We don't know, because the last Forest Service survey of spotted owls in the Bull Run was done in 1993. At the time, I think they found about 22 pairs of spotted owls in the Bull Run. What's happened since then is a species called the barred owl, B-A-R-D. It's not native to the Northwest. It's an invasive species. It's native to the Midwest and the East Coast. That has migrated out to the Pacific Northwest since the 1990s, and it has pushed the spotted owl out of its nest sites in large parts of its range. The Water Bureau has a wildlife biologist, and he's done a few very cursory surveys, and he's seen a fairly large population of barred owls and very, very few spotted owls. So it's not good news for the spotted owl. So as I mentioned, the environmental community groups like the Sierra Club, Oregon Wild, were not comfortable with that administrative plan offering sufficient protection. So they lobbied the Oregon delegation to submit legislation to Congress that would update the 1977 law to make it crystal clear that no logging is permitted in the Bull Run water supply drainage. They did that in 1996. A law was passed in 1996, signed by President Clinton. It put the entire the entire boundary of the Bull Run water supply drainage off limits to logging, except for logging that was necessary to construct a new reservoir or a new hydroelectric power line, or if it was absolutely essential to protect water quality. The Water Bureau thought that would be the end of the argument, right? I mean, we're preserving the water supply drainage. What more could you ask for? Well, Dr. Miller and the other environmental groups were still not satisfied. They wanted the entire 147 square mile boundary including the buffer zone, which can be as wide as 2 miles in some areas. They wanted the entire boundary closed to logging. Well, all of the stars were aligned politically in 2001, and both the Democrats and the Republican members of the Oregon delegation got together. They submitted the legislation, and it passed in 2001. And ever since, so that put the entire Bull Run closure boundary off limits to logging. So during the course of my career, there were people that transferred into the Water Bureau from other utilities. Maybe they came from Colorado or Arizona or New Mexico, and areas that operate under a different paradigm from a fire risk standpoint. So if you've read anything about fire ecology and fire risk, you know that there have been some massive scale insect epidemics, forest insect epidemics in the Intermountain West area. The mountain pine beetle has killed trees on millions of acres and has really made them vulnerable to fire. Other areas where they haven't, they've maybe done too good a job of protecting these areas from fire and not let fire do its natural thing. They've put us in a situation in areas east of the Bull Run where if a fire happens, it will burn more catastrophically than it otherwise would under natural conditions, because we've allowed the fuel levels to build up over the decades and decades due to fire suppression. Well, the same argument doesn't hold true at the Bull Run and areas like it, because these wet, moist areas just are, they only burn under very extreme kind of black swan conditions. And I'll talk more about that after I open up the gate for the bus. So we're within the Bull Run closure boundary. All the area that you see out the side of the bus and behind the bus, this all drains to the Sandy River. So it's not part of the Bull Run water supply drainage. Joe is going to stop the bus in about maybe 5 minutes. We'll pause right at the saddle point, which is the eastern boundary of the water supply drainage, so you can kind of orient yourself geographically. Also, when we get off the bus in about maybe 20 to 25 minutes for our hike, I've got a large-scale map that I'll hold up, and I'll kind of orient you as to where we are, because it's often disorienting for members of the public. After this long bus ride, you just wonder where we are exactly, which road we drove on to get here, so I'll point that out when we stop. So as I mentioned, you really have to be aware of your geographic context when you start evaluating, what the risk of fire is in an area like the watershed. So on average, we get one fire every 3 years, and they're very, very small fires caused by lightning strikes. So a cloud to ground strike will start a small fire at the base of a tree. Typically, it kind of burns undetected for a few days, sometimes for a few weeks. And then either a fire lookout or a surveillance plane will pick up that smoke and they'll call it in. The Forest Service will send a 2 or 3 person crew out, and they'll cut the tree down, they'll mop it up, and then that's the end of the story. One of the projects that I oversaw during my career with the Water Bureau was a fire history study. And I looked around and I said, well, who's the most experienced and qualified scientist to do this study? And at the time, there was a University of Washington professor named Dr. James Agee, who had published probably more scientific literature about fire ecology of forests like the Bull Run Watershed. So if you went to any kind of a fire ecology conference, Jim Agee would be the moderator or one of the primary speakers or organizers of the conference. So I contacted him and I said, I would love to have you and your team of graduate students do a fire study in the Bull Run, so we'd have kind of a credible, scientifically based study to base our management on. So he did that. He had one of his master's students do his thesis on the fire history of the Bull Run Watershed. So in the summer of 1992 and 93, there was a small army of graduate students driving around the watershed, hiking around, using a device called an increment borer. It's a hand drill basically that drills into the trees. You can extract a core about a 1/4 inch in diameter, and then you can carefully count the rings on that core and determine the age of the tree. So the age of the tree determines, at least for Douglas fir, when a fire burned in the area. So for trees that were too large to get to the center, they relied on clear cuts where they took a chainsaw and they took a slab off of the stump on a clear cut, and they took that slab back to their lab in Seattle. They polished it and they very carefully counted all the rings to be able to accurately to date the age of the trees. What he concluded was that a catastrophic fire burned almost the entire boundary of the Bull Run in the 1490s decade, so a little over 500 years ago. They also found 2 small isolated areas in the center of the watershed where the trees were 750 years old. So I tell people the garden variety age of trees in the Bull Run Watershed is about 500 years. The trail that we're going to walk down is kind of a blend of trees that are 350 years old and 500 years old.
Is it mostly Doug fir?
Yeah, so the dominant species is Douglas fir. Yeah.
Have you guys had any issues with invasive species?
It's a good question. So the woman here in the seat behind me said, "Do we have any issues with invasive species?" We have invasive plants along the roadsides, and the road management crews have kind of been their own worst enemy on that, because oftentimes they'll be cutting brush in areas outside the Bull Run, and they'll bring the weed seeds in and doing mechanical brushing. So you'll see lots of evidence of Scotch broom and Himalayan blackberry along the roadsides as we get further down in elevation. So the focus, we have an invasive weed coordinator. So I was the first invasive weed person in the Water Bureau. And then I decided, I'm not a botanist, and we need somebody who really specializes in this. So we ended up hiring a person whose full-time job is just invasives. And the thrust of our program is what's called the EDRR, which stands for Early Detection Rapid Response. And essentially, they've kind of given up on these species like Scotch broom that have been established for 100 years and that are very hard to eradicate. I'll pick that up in just a second. So Joe is pausing just briefly to show you that we're at the eastern boundary of the water supply drainage. So all the area behind of us drains to the Sandy River. All the area in front of us drains to the Bull Run River. The road off to our left goes to a snow gauging station and a fire lookout. The road to the right was decommissioned in 2005. The Forest Service decommissioned about half of the road miles that used to exist here. Yeah, question in the back.
Is this all covered with snow?
It's all covered with snow.
Yeah, so we're probably around 3,400 feet elevation. So this is snow covered throughout the winter at this elevation.
Do people have to snowshoe in, whatever? Do you guys snowshoe in or whatever? I'm assuming.
We have a snow cat. So
Okay.
we have a snowcat that can, just like ski areas do, and so we come up to areas like Bull Run Lake even during the winter months just to check on the facilities.
Right. That's what I would assume. It's
Yeah, and then they when they get off the snowcat, they walk around using snowshoes. And then the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, they were formerly known as the SCS, Soil Conservation Service. We contract with them to do snow surveys and to maintain snow gauges at 3 sites in the Bull Run. So we have data dating back to the 1970s on snow depth, snow water equivalent. So the predominant form of precipitation in the Bull Run watershed is rain rather than snow. And that's because it's a fairly low elevation watershed. The diversion works at Headworks is about 750 feet elevation.
Wow.
The highest elevation on the ridge lines is about 4,700 feet. The average elevation is somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500 feet. So the dominant form of precip is rain rather than snow. Having said that, if snow can be significant in terms of helping bolster the summer stream flows. If we have a winter with low snowpack, we find that we have lower stream flow in the summer months, and the stream flow starts to decline earlier in the spring than it otherwise would if we have a very deep, healthy snowpack. So you notice we have to slow down for these kind of bumpy spots on the road. And that's because there just has not been sufficient funding to manage the road system as we would really prefer. During a period of heavy logging, the Forest Service had adequate revenue to come back after their timber sales and upgrade the road, to maintain the road in very, very good condition. But ever since they've been prohibited from doing logging after by the legislation passed in '96, they haven't had a funding source. There's no funding mechanism to bring dollars back to the Bull Run watershed to do road maintenance. So I worked with their engineers and foresters in the late 1990s to come up with a plan to decide which roads do we need to maintain for fire access and for administrative access, and which roads can we afford to decommission or deactivate. There used to be around maybe 370 miles of roads in and around the Bull Run watershed. A lot of those roads were just short spur roads that were put in solely for logging purposes, and they didn't really serve any long-term purpose. We sat down with a map and we redlined roads that we could afford to do without. The Forest Service completed all of the road decommissioning work, I think, in around 2010 or 2011. So when I say decommission, it typically means that anywhere where there's a drainage pipe called a culvert, they excavate the culvert out and they try and restore the stream channel configuration to its original native condition. They'll also fracture the asphalt on the road by having like a D9 Caterpillar tractor use its ripper teeth and fracture the asphalt, and that'll help promote vegetation from coming up from the bottom of the road bed. Brush species like red alder and willow will actually come through the cracks in the asphalt and help recover the area. So part of my 15 minutes of fame was I was interviewed for the Oregon Field Guide segment in October 2009. You can still see it on their website. If you go to Oregon Field Guide, and then you can, there was a features program in October 2009, and they interviewed me on a road that had been decommissioned about 5 years earlier, and I'm standing in this thicket of alder and I'm describing the road decommissioning benefits. There's also a half-hour long documentary about the Bull Run that's also on the OPB website, although I think Joe said that they might have pulled it down. But if you're curious, go to opb.org and look at their Oregon Experience documentary series. And there might still be this 30-minute video about the history of the Bull Run watershed, which is pretty interesting. When Forest Service revenues for road maintenance kind of went in the tank, as I described, because they're tied to logging, they came to the Water Bureau. They said, "Okay, you guys have deep pockets. You've got all this water revenue. How about if you take care of the road system?" And we looked at each other and said, we know a heck of a lot about pipes and tanks and pumps and reservoirs and dams, but we don't know the first thing about road maintenance. So the first couple of years after that handoff, we hired a private contractor to do things like road brushing and culvert maintenance. And then our crews who maintain the water supply conduits and do other work, they said, well, heck, we could do that. So they presented a proposal to management, and they said, how about if we do that in-house? We could do a better job, we could do it cheaper, we could do it better. So the management and the Water Bureau agreed with that, and ever since around 1999, we've been doing all the road maintenance in-house. So some of the more sophisticated higher tech stuff, we hire contractors, we do a formal design, we go out to bid, things like building retaining walls, building bridges, doing asphalt overlays. That's the kind of work that is better suited contracting out for.
I have to say, I did kind of expect this to be gravel. I'm a little surprised it is paved.
Yeah, you said you expected to see gravel roads. So when we bring watershed managers from other systems like Seattle, San Francisco, New York City, they're absolutely just stunned to see paved roads in a rural area like this. And I asked my Forest Service colleagues, I said, well, why are the roads paved in the Bull Run? And the myth was that, the city insisted that they paved them for water quality reasons, and they said no, that they were built for economic reasons. They were built during an era of active logging. If we were doing this tour in the 1970s, there would be log truck after log truck just running us off the road. It would just be a thoroughfare of log trucks, one after the other, just barreling down here at Mach 3 speed. So the engineers for the Forest Service decided, hey, we can do logging more months of the year if we had paved roads. We could get the logs out quicker to the mills. We could, rather than being shut down due to adverse weather, we could do logging, 10 months of the year rather than 4 months of the year. So that was the primary reason why they paved these roads. And it's just sort of a secondary ad hoc benefit was that you get less surface erosion on a paved surface than you do on a gravel surface.
Interesting. It seems to be the opposite, that road runoff can go through gravel, but that would...
You tend to get, unless you really maintain your ditch lines and culverts effectively, there's more of a surface erosion risk with gravel roads.
Interesting.
So back to the fire ecology situation. So I mentioned that there was a large catastrophic fire that burned almost the entire watershed in the 1490s decade. There have been other smaller large-scale fires since that period. For example, in the 1660s, the area that you'll see on the hill slopes around Bull Run Lake, that subbasin burned in around the 1660s decade. There was a large fire that burned around the two reservoirs in the 1870s, so that fire predated the reservoir construction. So interesting, what that fire history study found was that it was the younger stands that burned more frequently. The areas down in the low elevation had burned maybe 3-4 times over the last 500 years. Some of the fires were on the scale of maybe a few thousand acres up to maybe 10,000. So it's been 500 years since we've had a very large-scale fire. And the principal investigator for that study concluded the average return interval statistically for a large catastrophic fire is 1 in 350 years. So it's about the same risk as a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, about a 1 in 350 year event. So fire is one of the issues that the city council and the chief engineer and other principal engineers in the Water Bureau are looking at to decide whether we should build filtration or whether we can get by safely with ultraviolet light disinfection. One advantage of filtration is if we did, God forbid, have a large catastrophic fire with all of the subsequent erosion, we could be in much better position from a resiliency standpoint if we have filtration to filter out that sediment. But it has a cost trade-off, so you have to kind of look at the risk and benefit on the equation there. If you look at the fire protection program of any wildland area like this, think of it as kind of a three-legged stool. You have fire suppression, you have fire prevention, and fire detection. So we detect fires in multiple ways in the Bull Run. Number one, we have a fire lookout, kind of an old school lookout that was built in 1953. That's on the southern boundary of the watershed. It has a great view of the entire basin. So that's staffed from typically early July through early October. So the fire lookout is a contractor for the Forest Service, and he recruited me to substitute for him the week of August 7th. So this will be the first time that I have an opportunity to actually be in the lookout on a multi-day basis.
And you basically stay up there 24/7 while
24/7, yeah. So
you live up
he's
there.
typically up there for maybe like 10 days at a time, and then he finds volunteers or subcontractors to spell him for between 2 and 5 days.
Okay.
How qualified do you have to be a volunteer?
You don't have to be super qualified. Yeah. No, I mean,
Right up
like
my alley.
they'll give you, maybe like a 3-hour training to orient you in the geography, the radio protocols. You have to gather some weather. You have to collect some weather data. So it's pretty basic. Yeah. No, there's like a little house on top of a 50-foot scaffold. So it has a gas stove, it has a refrigerator, it has a cooktop. There's no shower. I think he has a solar shower, so he has like a black bag that he fills with 5 gallons of water, and then just the sun's solar radiation heats up the water in the bag, and then so that's a shower. But so it's kind of a joke. He has like an Oregonian little newspaper thing. So, and every time that I would come up and visit him, I would bring him some ice cream. So.
Aww.
So in addition to the fire lookout, the Forest Service and the State Department of Forestry, every time there's a significant lightning storm, they will fly kind of in crisscross fashion all the national forests and the state forest land in Oregon with a fixed-wing surveillance plane. They'll go just back and forth in these transects, keeping their eyes peeled for any kind of smoke from a lightning strike. They'll typically do that, 2 days up to a week after that lightning event, just to look for smokes. In some cases, we've had airline pilots flying 747s coming in and out of PDX Airport, call in fires in the Bull Run, and they've been pretty accurate on giving us like a latitude, longitude reading. The third way we can get a clue as to where there might be a fire is there's a network of these ground-based stations. They're electromagnetic sensors, and they can tell with plus or minus 500-foot accuracy where the location of a cloud-to-ground strike has been. The Water Bureau has a subscription to that service, that we have a login and a password, and so we can get real-time information about where there's been lightning strikes in the watershed. So we'll do that. Our GIS technician will come in the morning, he'll download the data, he'll produce a map, he'll convert that to a PDF, and then he'll email that out to the field crews and ask them to kind of be on the lookout for fires in these areas that have downstrikes. So that's been a very effective tool as well. In terms of the second leg of the school is fire prevention. And when the fire severity gets serious enough, we'll shut down the contractors at like 1 o'clock p.m. Because the fire danger is more risky in the afternoon hours than it is in the morning. The relative humidity declines in the afternoon. So oftentimes, as we get later in the fire season, we rely on the Forest Service to tell us, what the fire danger rating is, and therefore whether we should shut our crews down. If things get really serious, then sometimes there's a total shutdown, and they can't operate mechanized equipment like road brushers at any time during the day. That's very rare for that to happen. it's much more common to be to have to shut down at 1 o'clock p.m.
How does the viewer determine which fires they're allowed to burn and which ones they protect?
So the question is, how do we decide which fires are safe to let burn, and versus fires that we should quickly extinguish? So we have a long-standing policy in the Bull Run Watershed, in agreement with the Forest Service and the state, to extinguish all fires. So there's no let burn policy like there would be in a wilderness area, for example. So we have a very aggressive, assertive fire suppression program. So even some people would argue, well, that's overkill, that fire is part of the natural ecology and you need to let it do its thing if it's not really putting the water supply at risk. But because there's just so much hanging in the balance in terms of the public health risk of a catastrophic fire, we have a very aggressive fire protection program. And because of the difference in the fire ecology of this area, the fact that we suppress those fires has not put us in an adverse situation with regard to therefore having a risk of greater catastrophic fire by virtue of suppressing fires. This is such a wet, moist area that if I took you on the same hike in August or September, and we took a small shovel and we dug down in the organic layer, you would still find moist organic material even in August and September. So it's an area with a very, very low risk of fire, extremely low. These like down logs can stay moist throughout the whole fire season. It would take what I would call a perfect storm condition. It would take, prolonged dry season, strong east winds, either a high frequency of human-caused ignitions or ignitions caused by lightning. All those things would have to line up. And that situation happened, not at the Bull Run, but in an area about 10 miles east of here in 2011. There was a fire called the Dollar Lake Fire. It started in a very typical way, like a single lightning strike. Started a very small fire in the Mount Hood wilderness areas on the northern side of Mount Hood. The Forest Service had kind of a let burn policy that said we're just going to keep an eye on it. It's not doing anything. Well, the fire grew and it grew and it grew, and it was burning from west to east. And I'll never forget, we were coming up on Labor Day weekend, and I coordinated with my colleague from the Forest Service. I said, I'm going to be going on a bike ride on Saturday of Labor Day weekend. Do I need to pay close attention? Is that fire going to do anything? And he sent me a map showing a color-coded series of bands saying, here's the risk of a fire coming anywhere close to the Bull Run. And the map showed that there was less than a 1% risk it would come within 3 miles of the watershed. Well, here I am. I'm going for my bike route out to Edgefield, and I'm having a beer and a sandwich at the Edgefield outdoors, a beautiful September morning or noon. And my phone rings, and it's the deputy district ranger for the Hood River District. And he said, well, things changed, and the fire changed direction, and it burned 3 miles in 3 hours, and it's headed towards the Bull Run. He said, you might want to pedal home as fast as you can, get your fire gear, and come out to the camp. So I never ridden my bike so fast in my life. So I downed the last few swigs of my beer. I got on my bike. I rode back home. I packed in my gear, and I spent the next eight days in the fire camp south of Hood River. And I was sort of in their hip pocket. I attended all of the briefings. They had briefings 3 times a day at 5:30 a.m., at noon, and then the evening. And it was interesting, just getting firsthand exposure to their incident management program for dealing with these large fires. It was done in a very professional way, very very methodical, disciplined way. And the ironic thing, so that one afternoon when the fire burned 3 miles in the direction they didn't want it to go, a few days later they tried to backburn to try and burn the fire out. And they used what I call flaming ping pong balls. They had helicopters that were spewing out these balls about the size of ping pongs that were full of flammable material, hoping that they could ignite the fuels on the forest floor and then backburn the fire. Well, none of those were igniting. So when they wanted the fire to burn, it wouldn't burn, and when they didn't want the fire to burn, it was burning. So that's just one of the nuances of wildland fire ecology. So off to the left side of the bus, you're beginning to get a kind of a really good landscape view of the upper part of the Bull Run Watershed. And you can see differences in the sizes of the trees, the color of the trees. So you can begin to distinguish the old growth from the younger stands, which originated from logging. So if we were doing this tour in 1984, those areas that are now kind of shorter green trees would be just blown down timber. It would just be a sea of brown from all of the trees having been blown down by the windstorm. And that means that the Forest Service crews are pretty well overtaxed. So it makes it our most vulnerable situation from a fire suppression standpoint because your resources are spread just razor thin. There's no margin for error as a result of having those fire crews maybe working on fires elsewhere on the Mountain National Forest or on the Deschutes Forest or closest places that are pretty far away from the Bull Run. Yeah, 2015 was a pretty quiet year here. We didn't. Which year?
When did we have the years did we have a lot of fires? Well, not here, but
Yeah.
in Central.
I think 2015. I think it was a busy fire year in Central Oregon, but thankfully we didn't have much action in this neck of the woods in 2015. And yeah, we were very lucky that we didn't have a fire here in the Bull Run in 2015. This is kind of an interesting geologic formation on the right side of the bus. This is called a talus slope, but it's also known as a scree slope, S-C-R-E-E. So this is basalt, and the slope was formed by there was a vent at the top of the ridge that sent out this basalt material, and then over time the rock has fractured and weathered, and the angle is about as steep as nature can hold it. It's what's called the angle of repose. Any steeper, and that rock would just continue to cascade down slope. It's very, very tricky to walk across these if you've ever done hiking in these talus slopes.
Is this landslide prone? Would you say landslide prone?
Well, no, I would say it's fairly stable. I mean, it's had thousands of years to come to a stable slope. So it's not like you're going to see a landslide. But the areas where you'll see a situation in just a moment here where the Forest Service did some rock quarry work and they undercut the toe of this talus slope just to be able to pull out some rock. And so that can trigger a slide if you undercut the base of it. Speaking of slides, one of the last projects that I initiated was a landslide risk study in 2013. I initiated a intergovernmental agreement with the State Department of Geology to use what's called LIDAR data. So LIDAR stands for light detection and ranging. It uses basically laser beams that are shot from a fixed wing plane to shoot those lasers down to the ground, and then they measure the time difference between when the laser leaves the plane and when it goes back up to the receptor. And by measuring the time difference, they know that it travels at the speed of light, and just by looking at the millisecond time difference between when it leaves the plane and arrives back, they can measure the distance between the plane and the ground surface. They can map the surface of the ground to plus or minus 1 foot accuracy. It's just phenomenal accuracy. And I still don't understand how to this day, but some of those laser beams can make their way through dense vegetation all the way to the forest floor and then ricochet their way back up to the plane by bouncing off of vegetation and rocks. So when they did that, it revealed a lot that we had not seen before about the location and the nature of landslides. I think they mapped over 1,000 landslides in the Bull Run, most of which we didn't even have a clue were there. I know a lot of my colleagues said, you don't even want to know the answer to that question. Let's not even ask. But I thought, the prudent thing to do is to know where the risky areas are, so that if we do road maintenance projects or some kind of a project in the future, we know that we should avoid those landslide risk areas. All right, we're almost to the trailhead of this hike. So in terms of time, I would say it's probably about a 20-minute hike downhill, and then maybe let's give ourselves about 5 minutes to kind of get pictures at the spring. And I'll talk a little bit about the nature of old growth forests and the interaction between forest and water quality and water supply when we're at the base of the trail. And then it'll be about maybe a 25-minute hike back. So round trip, total time about 45 minutes. Your stuff will be perfectly safe at the bus. There's no risk of anybody, coming in here and stealing your purse or your backpack. So things are perfectly safe on the bus.
We're there. Right there.
Here is Bureau of Land Management, and the blue shaded lands are City of Portland Water Bureau lands. The black boundary is the closure boundary, so this area is closed to the public. So here's a quiz. So what's the only part of the Bull Run closure boundary where it's actually legal to hike? Anybody?
The far part east side.
Yes. So the Pacific Crest Trail, there's about a 9-mile segment of the Pacific Crest Trail that goes all the way from Mexico to Canada. So 9 miles of that 2,600 mile long trail goes through the Bull Run closure boundary. It's right here on the east of Bull Run Lake. There's almost no point on that trail where you can see Bull Run Lake. You have to get off the trail and kind of bushwhack. And occasionally we have some adventurous hikers who do that, but most of the people who hike the Pacific Crest Trail in this area are what are called through hikers. I mean, they're trying to hike 20 miles a day and they don't have time to take a detour.
So legally, you have to stay on the trail there. You can't.
You have to stay on the trail.
Okay.
Anyway, this is the Hatfield Wilderness, and so this is a kind of an area of concern for me and others in the Water Bureau. So people who are camping and starting camping fires here, if they don't pay attention and extinguish those fires, they could, in the wrong conditions, those fires could burn uphill and into the Bull Run. So it's something we're always kind of on alert about. So the road that we drove on, we drove along this boundary here, along Lolo Pass Road. So this is the part of the boundary where the road was the boundary. So right now we're right here. So this is Bull Run Lake is about a mile to the southeast of us, and that's going to be the place where we have lunch. There's about 4 picnic tables. There's a porch with a covered a deck with a covered porch to have lunch. It's a great place. So we're located about maybe 1.5 miles northwest of Bull Run Lake. And the spring that I'll take you to in just a few moments, the origin of that water for the spring is leakage of water from Bull Run Lake, which is about maybe 350 feet elevation above us now. And that lake was formed by an ancient landslide about maybe 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So it was a glacial valley with a very simple stream, and this massive landslide from the ridge on the north of Bull Run Lake blocked the valley, and it impounded water in this lake.
It's like a natural dam.
It's like a natural dam.
Wow.
And so because it's landslide material, it's very kind of mixed particle size, and it's very porous. So the water just percolates through the bottom of the lake, and it pops out in 2 springs. This is the second spring that are in a series of 3 springs. Great, thanks. So just real quickly, this is Joe Ramirez, our bus driver.
I actually work in maintenance and construction. So, repairing water mains, main breaks, new fire hydrants, that kind of thing.
So we'll go clockwise. Richard Robbins, your tour guide. This is probably going to be one of the most scenic spots you've ever had lunch in your life. I guarantee you that it's so iconic. It's on the cover of this book. It's the sketch on the bottle that I passed around. If you look at Wikipedia, you see lots of photos of Bull Run Lake taken from the same spot we're going to have lunch. So really enjoy it. Should be a nice view of Mount Hood today. So the story of Bull Run Lake is kind of an on-again, off-again water supply resource for the Portland Water Bureau. So it was the very first reservoir that we managed beginning in 1917. So it was a way to come up and augment the natural stream flow by turning a valve and releasing water during the summer months to increase the stream flow. And then every time we built a new dam, a major dam, they would stop using Bull Run Lake. For example, in 1929, when the large concrete dam was built, about a 200-foot tall dam that we'll tour later on, they completely just walked away from Bull Run Lake. They didn't come up here for decades. And then again in the 1960s, another dam was built. And then once again, they didn't use Bull Run Lake for probably 15, 17 years. And then in the 90s, we had some water supply shortages. We started coming back to Bull Run Lake yet again. So it's been this up and down seesaw. Use it, forget about it. Use it, forget about it. It's always looked upon as kind of our ace in the hole to augment the natural stream flow if we really get in a pinch. So on the rare occasions when we do release water from Bull Run Lake, and we've only done that 1 year since 2001, we did it last summer, water pulls up in that vegetated area on the left side of the bus to a depth of around maybe 10 feet, and all the water just disappears through the porous sediments, and it reemerges in a spring about a half a mile to the west of here. The water flows surface in that stream for just a short distance, and then it completely disappears in the channel and reemerges in the spring that we just hiked to. It's a kind of a fascinating hydrogeology here. The workers who built the original wooden dam at Bull Run Lake was only about a 15-foot tall structure. It allowed us to draw water from the top 15 feet. They needed lodging up here. The first summer that they worked, they just lived in tents, and that was pretty miserable. So they decided, hey, we'll just cut a few trees around the lake, and we'll just build some cabins. They built a total of about 5 cabins. One of them was kind of the designated cookhouse. On more than one occasion, they had a fire in the cookhouse and it burned down, so they rebuilt the cabin. So one of the most rewarding projects in my career was being the project manager to reconstruct one of those circa 1917 cabins. And the reason why we had to reconstruct it was there was a very strong windstorm that happened in December 2004, where a large Douglas fir blew down and destroyed the porch of the cabin. It sheared off all of the roofline logs called the purlins. And so we were then at a crossroads from a preservation standpoint. Do we just let the structure deteriorate and no longer use it for tours, or do we invest the resources and the time to rebuild the cabin to make it safe to bring tour groups to again? So it became kind of a political battleground. It became probably the single most controversial line item in the Water Bureau's budget in 2006. So it was rebuilt, I think, for a total cost of around $210,000.
That's
which
peanuts.
seems like a lot of money, but it was a 4-person crew. They completely deconstructed it. They moved the logs down to the parking areas. They carefully tagged and identified each and every log segment so that they could put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I was in charge of ordering replacement logs for the logs that had deteriorated or decomposed too much. I was in charge of finding a source of cedar that we could then use a contractor to split cedar shakes to re-roof the cabin. So if you asked that 4-person Water Bureau crew, like, what was the most rewarding project you've worked on in your career, I would say hands down they would all say rebuilding the cabin. So we'll get a spectacular view of Mount Hood in just a few seconds here.
Getting it right now.
And this whole area isn't public access.
No,
Right, once we went through that gate.
yeah, once you went through the gate, there's
yeah.
no public access here.
200,000 is peanuts.
The cost?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's peanuts. That's like what, less than a penny a ratepayer?
Right. But it was symbolic because our wholesale water districts in particular, they were asking questions like, well, you don't use these cabins to store water, you don't have equipment in them, why do we need to pay for reconstructing this cabin? It's of no value. But I think you'll agree after you see them that these have really historical value. When we get off the bus for lunch, you guys are welcome to come down right to this point here and take as many photos as you want to. So that this is kind of a boundary point. So if you could please restrict your walking to just this point between here and the cabins.
So what's this thing?
So this is what part of the valve works that was built in the late 50s to release water from the lake. So we no longer use this set of valves. We use a different valve when we do release water. There are two porta potties up here. So if you need to use those, go ahead and take advantage of that. Our next restroom opportunity will be in about maybe an hour and a quarter. So I've got about 10 minutes to 12 now. Our next restroom break opportunity will be around 1 o'clock. These are probably the most sanitary porta potties you'll ever see in your life because of the very limited traffic we have up here, and they're cleaned quite frequently. So Joe's going to turn the bus around. You'll be able to see on the left side of the bus, one of the cabins, there's two or three picnic tables over there. I'm going to go up to the cabin that I helped rebuild. That has the most scenic view. So even if you have your lunch here, I would encourage you to go up to the cabin that we reconstructed. And on this kiosk here, there's a very interesting image that shows the LiDAR landscape image of this area. And you can clearly see the landslide that created Bull Run Lake. You can see the spring that we walked down to. So let's synchronize watches. I have 11:50. Let's give ourselves a half an hour. Let's try and be back on the bus by 20 minutes after 12 in order to stay on time. All right?
Go ahead.
To scramble up 110 feet of cliff just to get above that.
Wow.
So that was a challenge. Those were challenging days.
110 feet of cliff?
What's that?
I'm saying it again, 110 feet of cliff. Like mountain
It's like a 110. I mean, it wasn't like a sheer cliff, but you'd have to scramble up rocks and on steep slopes. We didn't use ropes and harnesses, but you had to be really careful. You'd use like cork boots with like boots with spikes on the bottom, so you could grip the wood. Yeah. So we'd be waiting at the stream channel, and you'd have to go on land to get around that waterfall feature. Lake of the House is a small tributary to this reservoir called Bear Creek. For a while, this was called Bear Creek Dam. So it's gone through an evolution. It's called Bull Run Dam 1 and Bear Creek Dam. Or it was called just Bull Run Dam when there was only one dam. It was called Bull Run Dam and then Bear Creek Dam. And when the second dam was built, it was called Dam 1. So we're now at Dam 1. So I guess maybe someday they'll name it after me. Who knows? But, so it's a concrete gravity dam. Even though it's in the shape of an arch, it's considered technically a concrete gravity dam. It's 18 feet wide at the top. It's 165 feet at the base. It's kind of like a triangular wedge. It's just vertical on the upstream side and it slopes on the downslope side. It's 970 feet across from end to end. It was built with 24 individual pours of concrete, and each of those pours are interlocked in horizontally and vertically, so that they have these notches. So this concrete isn't going anywhere. We're kind of outside of the Cascadia subduction zone area, but if there was a subduction zone quake, all the engineers tell me that this would have no problem at all surviving a very massive coastal zone quake. So it's 195 feet deep in terms of water depth. It holds 10 billion gallons of total storage. Of that 10 billion, we feel comfortable using about 7 of the 10. And that's for water quality reasons, because we are an unfiltered water system. We don't want to take the risk to draw the pool down any lower than about maybe 70 feet from the top. Otherwise, we start getting turbidity, or we get cloudiness in the water. So it's just a limit that we impose on ourselves. And then the second dam, that impounds 7 billion total. We only feel comfortable using about 3 billion of that 7. So we've used 7 here, 3 billion there. 7 plus 3 is 10 billion gallons total. So in addition, during the summer months, we have maybe between 10 and 20 billion gallons of water that flows into the reservoir. So we're not relying just on the storage in the pool. We're relying on the influence streams coming into the dam, plus the storage in the reservoir to serve our needs in the summer.
So how much is that in terms of days of water usage? Like how many?
Well, I guess you could do the math. Our average demand, or our average winter demand, is about 80 million gallons a day.
Okay.
In the summer, the average seasonal demand in July, August, September is about 120 to 130. And there are some really hot summer days when it can bump up to maybe 160.
Okay.
So I looked at the demand yesterday, it was 127 million gallons. So if you take that storage divided by, let's say 120, then that'll tell you how much.
Okay.
But again, keep in mind that it's not just the storage in the reservoir;
Right.
it's the stream flow coming in as well.
Okay.
So the paradigm that any kind of water supplier in the western United States has to operate under. This doesn't apply so much to the eastern United States or the Midwest, but in the summer, whether we acknowledge it or not, we're part of the arid West. Portland is part of the arid West because we have a prolonged dry season. And if water use is shown in green, this only shows three seasons: spring, summer, and fall. So in the spring, you reach a crossover point to where your demand is higher than the incoming supply. And then in the fall, we have the fall rains that come predictably in October, November, December. We know that the incoming flow is going to be above the demand. So that's another crossover point. So what we don't know going into each summer is what's the beginning point here of the crossover and what's the ending point of the crossover in the fall. And then what's the magnitude of the difference? Is it going to be a very severe, long drought, or is it going to be a very brief summer season? We honestly don't know. We have some forecast information. If we don't have a very big, deep snowpack, then we know we're going to be in a little more critical situation during the summer months. So as a result, each year we have a team of Waterbury employees that put together a seasonal water supply plan that has kind of a toolkit saying, here's the tools in the toolbox that we're going to use if we run short of water. We've got conservation. We could ask our wholesale districts to get water somewhere else. We could run the wells. We could draft water from Bull Run Lake. We could take a risk and draw water, deeper down in the reservoir. There's all sorts of things we could do. So this is taking data from 3 representative years. And before I show you that, this is the guy who was the public works manager out here for 20 years. He manually plotted the drawdown in this reservoir for a 20-year period. And you can see it's just all over the map. It is just totally random. There's no predictability from year to year what's going to happen. And so in the most extreme case, the year when we had the furthest drawdown, it was the quickest refill. We were drawn down 80 feet in this reservoir, and in 3 days, boom, it filled.
Wow.
So that tells you volumes about the hydrology of this watershed. I mean, we get 135 inches of rain, and all of a sudden, and we're asking people to conserve water for the summer, and then almost overnight, we're going, whew, problem solved. The rains came. That happened one time the 3rd week in September. We were pumping water from Bull Run Lake, and we were asking for conservation from our customers, and all of a sudden, the storm rolled in, and boom, the reservoir refilled in 3 days. It can happen that quickly. So since it's pretty hard to track 20 years of spaghetti lines, I tried to make it a little simpler and show kind of a worst case and a middle case and a best case. So these are 3 years. The red line is 1987, and I put these on a level playing field by it's using a model that equates the temperature of the Portland airport with demand. So if you tell me what the temperature of the airport is on July 17th, I can tell you pretty much within plus or minus 5 million gallons a day what the demand is going to be. It's a very tight correlation. So we use the weather data from these 3 years to say, okay, what would the drawdown have been with 2014 population with that weather? And this is what happens. And this is what happens without the well field. So without the well field in 1987, we go below our comfort line. There's more water below this black line, but we don't feel comfortable tapping it. So this illustrates really clearly what the value of the well field is. It helps keep us above that threshold. The dark blue line is 2011. So this is kind of an average year. In an average year, we don't need to use the well field in the summer. We've got plenty of water in the reservoirs. We don't have to ask for stringent conservation. And then the light blue line is that's a very mild year. It's a very cool summer. We have early refill. We have a late drawdown. So the reason why the lines all jump up here in the spring is because of those metal gates that are in the spillway. So those were not part of the original dam construction design. Those were added in the mid-1950s. Think of them as like gigantic garage doors. And so they have a rubber seal at the bottom. They're lowered down in mid-April, and it backs water up an additional 9.5 feet. So that gains us an additional 1.1 billion gallons just with that added feature. So when we drop those gates in mid-April, then it raises the level of that lake about 9.5 or 10 feet. And it kind of surcharges the reservoirs. And then, so our goal at that point is to have, think of it like you're landing a 747. We want a nice, even glide path. We don't want to wait until the 11th hour and then go, holy mackerel, like conserve water. So we want to start the conservation message early in the summer to say, use water wisely. We got plenty of water, but just use it wisely. And then we don't want to have to turn the wells on full blast in August. We want to be able to turn a few wells on in July and a few more wells in August based on what the demand is looking like. So there's, in addition to water spilling over the spillway in the wintertime, there's two other ways to get water through that dam. One way is through the powerhouse. We added a powerhouse to this dam in 1981. So the engineers who designed it had a lot of forethought, even though it wasn't profitable to have hydropower in 1929. They knew that someday it would be, and so they put in the pipelines through the base of the dam so that you could construct a powerhouse at some day in the future. So there's a 24 megawatt plant. We've been selling power to PGE between 1982 and that 25-year contract expires at the end of August. And so, was there a wasp in it?
Yeah, there's some big thing, right?
Wasp.
I'd rather not.
I mean, they normally won't bother you. They'll just kind of hover and then just go by. So I don't know if you know, there was an article in the Sunday Oregonian about a new contract that we're trying to negotiate with like 4 different parties. So PGE said, we'll buy the power, but we don't want to operate the plants. We don't want to be in charge of scheduling. We don't want to be in charge of maintenance. Go find somebody else. We'll just buy the power. So there's some questions about the continued profitability of these powerhouses in the future. We talked PG into a very sweet deal for the city back in 1982, and we've really profited handsomely by that contract. So the other way we can route water from this reservoir to the lower one is the original valves in the dam. There's 3 kind of cone shaped. They look like gigantic Hershey's Kisses. And so it has a sleeve, and the sleeve pulls back and the water jets around that cone. And we can discharge, I think, 200 million gallons per day out of each one of those valves. So that's more than, even turning one valve on is more than enough to supply the daily needs in the summer. So we'll get an up-close personal look at those kind of original set of valves when we go down the stairway. We monitor water quality here every 2 weeks. We go out with a boat with an inboard motor, and we sidle up to a buoy, and we send a probe down. We can gather data on temperature and dissolved oxygen and turbidity. And then we have a sample bottle we send down at discrete depths, and we capture a volume about 1 liter, and you yank it up by hand or with a crank, take it back to the lab, you analyze it for nutrients and all sorts of chemical, biological variables. This is a very low sediment watershed because we're unfiltered. There's not much erosion. There's no management activity. And a question I often get on tours is, how much of this reservoir has been filled by sediment? That was a question that concerned us. We had a master's student from Portland State University, a geology graduate student, do a study, and she compared the topographic map from that was made before the dam was made. She compared that with what's called a bathymetric map that's developed from using sonar. And she compared the 2 topographic maps and also did sediment coring. And she concluded we've only lost 0.7% of the storage volume of the reservoir.
Wow.
Nice.
That is just a minuscule volume that has been lost to sedimentation.
It's been so long, too.
And I know, it's been since 1929. So if you talk to an engineer from the Army Corps of Engineers and you ask them, hey, in your reservoirs in the Cascade Range, how much volume have you lost to sediment? It would be a much, much higher percentage of the storage volume in the reservoir. I think that's. Are there any other questions about the dam? Oh, one interesting historical anecdote: the contractor who was in charge of building the dam, he had an engineer that he hired to design the dam. So the city didn't design it. We reviewed the plans and we made red line markup comments, but they relied on a private consultant to design the dam. Well, that individual named David Henney went on after this project, and he was part of the design team for Hoover Dam.
Oh.
Yeah. So some people think that there are some kind of parallels from a design standpoint between this dam and Hoover Dam that was built between 1931 and 1934. And the Water Bureau employee who lived in this house, he went on after this project, and he worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, and he became a very strong proponent of building dams on the Columbia River. So if you're a fan of dams on the Columbia, he's kind of your hero. If you don't like the dams on the Columbia, he's kind of the villain. So I don't know where you come down on that issue.
Yeah,
Who lives
they're,
here
they're,
Who lives here now?
Who
lives here?
No one lives here now, so we don't allow any overnight stays in the watershed. So this is used as a stopover point for tours, just like today. And one of the former bedrooms is set up as an office. There's a desk and a computer. And so if we have a project like a road reconstruction project, the inspector for the project will spend some of the hours of the day working here in an office environment. So there's telemetry. We have phone service. We have computer. We have internet coverage here by virtue of a microwave transmission.
oh.
There's no hardwire cables. It's all sent in and out of here by radio waves, by microwave.
I was noticing there are multiple companies from here that worked on the Hoover Dam, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think, and one of I was looking at Wikipedia last night,
Yeah.
and one of them was based in Portland.
Yeah, I was noticing that. I just was a while ago, but I was noticing that.
Regarding the design, I know that Mount Tabor has that same kind of feel. Is
Yeah.
there a reason why you guys follow the same, like, kind of, don't make it kind of more,
Yeah.
I guess? Or,
I think that was very common back in the turn of the century, early 1900s, to have more decorative, not cut any corners on the archways and the railings, things like that. So it was just very common in the early 1900s to just not do just a very plain design. But the Mount Tabor reservoirs, the original ones were built in 1894, and then there were two more built, I think, in 1911. Yeah.
Is the airspace restricted?
No, the airspace is not restricted. Sometimes I wish it was. One time I was doing some field work with a consultant, and we walked out right on top of the spillway, and I could hear the roar of a plane engine. I'm looking around going, what is that? And then it got closer and closer, and there was a World War II vintage P-51 Mustang.
Wow.
It was flying like right at water level.
Ooh.
And I'm looking, it's coming closer to the dam, and I'm going, holy mackerel!
Uh-oh.
And then he goes up to go over the top of the dam, and then he dives right back down, and he flies like right at water level on Reservoir 2.
Jeez, there's okay. I was going to say right here, it's like...
Wow.
So that's the only thing, that came pretty close to violating airspace right there.
Yeah.
Who built the dam?
It was a contractor based in Los Angeles. It was a Southern California company. I don't remember the name of it. Any more questions about the dam or about the house? Or?
So everyone that comes up here leaves at night. There's no one stays overnight in the area in the building. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, except for the lookout guy.
Except for the lookout guy.
Okay.
So he's technically like right on the rim of the
Oh,
watershed, so.
yeah.
And we built him a state-of-the-art restroom up there. And so, but we can't monitor whether he uses it all the time. But, so the only situation that I've experienced where we had Water Bureau crews stay in the watershed overnight was when we had to do emergency pumping at Bull Run Lake, and we needed someone up there around the clock to monitor the pumps. And so I think they laid out a bedroll in the cabins and stayed overnight in the cabins. But
Okay.
that was like the only exception.
Yeah. Okay.
but I was looking through the city archives, and interestingly enough, there was a black and white photo taken in 1971 from an airplane of this area, and it was like tent city. There were all sorts
Wow.
of tents out on the lawn. And I asked the Forest Service, I said, what was going on here? And they said, oh, there was a huge fire.
Huh.
And so this was used as a fire camp.
Hmm.
It was used as a fire camp for all the firefighters.
How long did it take to build that?
It took the question, how long did it take to build the dam? It took 2 years. Almost two solid years. Yeah.
Well, they could scoop water out there for fire, I guess, if they wanted to. Maybe.
Yeah, so we have a fire plan, and so the Forest Service has approval to use these drop buckets. Well, they have approval to use Bull Run Lake.
Oh, okay.
And if there was a fire really close by, it was very strategic to use water from the reservoirs, they have to ask our permission. But,
Okay.
I mean, chances are we would give them permission to dip
Okay.
buckets and extinguish the fire with it. So. Well, if there's no other questions, it's probably about the same time whether we walk to the dam or get on the bus and drive to the dam. So if you guys want to stretch your legs a little bit, I would say it's a nice day. Let's go ahead and just
Yeah.
walk across the lawn, just walk down the stairway of the porch. And I'm going to help walk up, and I'll catch up with you. Just walk down to the dam. We're going to walk.
Welcome to the Bull Run Dam number 2. If you look off the left side of us, you can see just the very tippy top of Mount Hood, poking his head up above the bridge line. So we're driving across Dam 2 now. This is an earth and rock-filled dam, completed in 1962. It's 110 feet tall. It stores 7 billion gallons. As I said, back at the house, we use about 3 billion of the 7 billion that are here. The buoys that you see off in the middle of the reservoir, that's where we sample water quality every 2 weeks. We have several ways to get water from this reservoir into the pipelines. One of the important features of a water utility, if you're serving 1 million people, you need about 4 or 5 backup plans of how to get water in your pipe. And this is probably the most important part of the system right here. So we have 2 intake towers. Each of those towers have 2 different ways to get water into the system. If you look on the right side of the bus, there's a small pool. That's called the diversion pool. That was formed in 1921 by construction of a 30-foot tall concrete dam. That was the dam that stopped a hazardous fish runs. So just imagine in 1921, this is just a forest, undeveloped forest, and you had a wild river running through here, and that one dam was what was diverting water into the pipelines. And so salmon up until 1921 could come way up into here. They could go up into what's now Reservoir 1. So the dams did not block salmon. That diversion dam is what blocks salmon and steelhead. So when the powerhouses were built in 1982, we entered into a mitigation agreement with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. We've been spending, I think, around $500,000 a year contributing to their fish hatchery program on the Clackamas River. So that's been our mitigation for the hydropower. Ever since 2009, we've been operating under the terms of a habitat conservation plan prepared by the Water Bureau. It's a 50-year plan. It calls for spending $93 million over 50 years. Those expenditures are heavily front-end loaded. And a perfect example of that front-end loading is that the bigger of the 2 towers with the blue on top, that feeds a 15-foot diameter tunnel below the base of the dam. We spent $38 million to retrofit that tower. We did that because the original construction did not design for multiple level intake, which is very important. You want to be able to select which level you're drawing from. So for whatever reason, they only had one single intake at the very bottom of the reservoir. And because of that, we were basically depleting our source of cold water early in the summer. So that in the late summer months, we were sending warm water down for all the fish, and warm water to town in the pipes. So we had to go through a very expensive retrofit just to correct a mistake that was made back in the early 1960s. So the take-home message is do it right the first time because it gets a lot more expensive. So the tower on the right is the south tower that feeds a 7.5-foot diameter tunnel below the base of the dam. Right now you can see all of that frothy water that's coming from the north tower today. normally we discharge to the powerhouse, and for the winter months when you're operating, when you have plenty of water, we're typically discharging through the powerhouse. It's a 24 megawatt plant. The water temperature is super important for anadromous fish, and so the operators who work here at Headworks, we have people that work 12-hour shifts, 24/7. They have really dialed it in. They know exactly how much water to target downstream to meet our temperature targets for fish, and they've been doing a marvelous job.
You have a standoff.
On weekend tours, like there's no one up here except for the tour bus on a Saturday or Sunday. So on a weekday, you've got Water Bureau and PG&E employees up here, and we often compete, head to head on the dam, and one of us needs to back up. So when we developed the habitat conservation plan, the regulatory agencies required us to evaluate in the document the cost and benefit of putting in fish ladders on this dam and the upper dam. And so we did that, but the numbers just didn't pencil out. We could spend a ton of money, a ton of ratepayer money, but getting fish into this reservoir, but then there's no spawning habitat. We've dedicated this piece of real estate to serve as a reservoir, so it's no longer, going to be able to function as anadromous habitat. I'd like to be able to take folks to Headworks, which is where we have the chlorine, but for safety reasons, we're not allowed to take public tours there. It would require about a half an hour briefing by the Headworks operators. You'd have to take a written test to make sure you understood the proper protocols if there was a chlorine leak. So we're just going to kind of drive slowly by it, just to give you kind of a glimpse of where we have the chlorine and where we screen the water. I mentioned earlier that we're facing a choice of either a $100 million ultraviolet plant or a $350 to $500 million filtration plant. The ultraviolet light plant, it would barely fit in here, so this is the preferred site. This is Headworks. The flat top building there is our control center. That's where the operators work. We have 24 one-ton cylinders of gaseous chlorine. During the summer months, we replenish our chlorine supply about once a week. Not all 24 cylinders, but we have several cylinders that are swapped out each week. Our laboratory used to be located right here on site, but that was moved downtown in the mid-1990s when the balance of the samples shifted from the watershed to the distribution system. On the right side, you'll get your first glimpse of the water supply conduits. There's two gigantic pipes here. These are two of the three conduits. The third conduit is underneath the bus, and it continues just straight ahead, and it goes below the spillway. So they range in diameter. The largest conduit is 66 inches at its initiation point, and it tapers down to, I think, around 54, 55 inches in town. So up until the mid-1960s, the workers who operated the valves at Headworks, they lived here on site with their families, so we provided government housing for those workers. This is an area called Kaiser Park. It's named after Lawrence Kaiser, who was one of the early superintendents of the water system. And the folks that lived up here had plenty of spare time, so on the weekends they would do things like build fountains. Whoa. Over on the right side, you can see a fountain that some of the workers built probably back in the 1920s, 1930s. The spillway for Dam 2 right there. So just imagine in a severe winter storm, you've got a wall of water about maybe 6-7 feet tall going over that spillway. during the 1964 flood, which is about the 100-year flood event for the Pacific Northwest, there was so much water spilling over that spillway that eroded, it damaged the road, and it took out 2 of our 3 conduits. Yeah, so 2 of our 3 conduits run underneath the road, and it damaged and severed the conduits.
So did that create an emergency?
What's that?
Did that create an emergency?
Yeah, it definitely created an emergency. So the other conduit that was more protected, it runs underneath the spillway. That could provide, I think, 50 million gallons a day. So they did like a very quick repair on both of the conduits to get them back in service. Really few things that we can do to manage for fish habitat in the lower Bull Run River. One of the few things we can do is add spawning gravel. So this gigantic pile of gravel on the left side of the bus is a 20-year supply of spawning gravel. We place that in the river at 3 strategic points, usually in December or January of each year, because the 2 dams act as very effective sediment traps. So there's not a natural recruitment or supply of natural gravel in the lower Bull Run River because of the dams that were constructed. So as a result, we have to put in artificial gravel for them. And then the storms, every year they flush the gravel out once again. So it's a constant kind of welfare system. This is our equivalent of Medicaid here, I guess. So there's a little flag on top, and we've named this Mount Kuchis in honor of the fish biologist Steve Kuchis, who ordered the rock and oversaw the plan. Security guard who patrols the gates for the Bull Run. So he doesn't work by himself. There's another security staff member who assists him, and they work in concert with the county sheriff's department and the Forest Service law enforcement folks as well. So it's not a one-man operation. It's kind of a concerted, coordinated effort between 4 different agencies. We're driving across is a piece of the old Burnside Bridge. It was constructed in 1893. It was moved here in 1926. Over on the right is PGE's former Bull Run powerhouse. That was decommissioned in 2006. That was a 24 megawatt plant. It routed water from the Sandy River at Marmot Dam over to the Little Sandy, which is kind of a misnomer. It's called the Little Sandy, but it's actually a tributary to the Bull Run. It took the combined flow of the Sandy and the Little Sandy and it routed it through a flume and a tunnel system to that powerhouse. So PGE reached a point where they needed to relicense that project, and they were facing some pretty high environmental mitigation costs. So they decided just to surrender their power generation license and decommission the project. Patch over on the left side of the road used to be a 150-acre lake, and that was the pre-impoundment reservoir for the powerhouse down by the river. So the water from the Sandy River, Little Sandy, would come in here. It was a very shallow, like 15-foot deep lake. So this was all decommissioned about 10 years ago. Was going to convert this to an elephant reserve. They're going to bring the zoo elephants out there because with the soft sand and the former lake bed, this would have been an ideal place for the elephants to walk and be able to exercise in a kind of a safe environment. For cost reasons, I think they opted to not develop this as a elephant reserve. Issues, there were some small creeks that appeared like once the area was restored to its natural configuration, we started seeing some wetlands and creeks, and they were concerned about the environmental impact of these huge elephants trampling on creeks and wetlands and meadows. River Station maintenance facility. This is where 15 to 16 workers operate out of that maintain the roads, the watershed, the pipelines, and the dams. On the right side is Dodge Park. This is a Water Bureau-owned park, so we're also kind of in the recreation business to a limited extent. There's overnight camping and picnicking here. Then we're about to cross the Sandy River. And if you look downstream, you'll see a green bridge. That's the bridge that carries conduit number 3. So the other 2 pipelines are buried below the riverbed on the left side and the upstream side of the bridge. Those conduits used to be on a bridge parallel to the road bridge.